Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise based in the UK, but becoming increasingly international. Our purpose, our mission, if you like, is to promote ongoing reform of the financial services sector so that it serves society better. We operate through 25 groups, one of which is all about investments, and that's obviously the main theme for today. We're looking at the general topic of hot topics in the investments world. We have a great lineup of speakers: Jeff Houston, Chris Sier, Mark Northway, Charlotte O'Leary, Martin White, and then at the end of the session we've got what we call the Just a Minute rounds with Dan Brocklebank and Robert Delner. For the one or two people who don't know much about the Transparency Task Force at all, I'll simply say that we are a collaborative community of people around the world who like the idea of the financial industry being more transparent, more truthful, more trustworthy. We want consumers to understand the deal that they're getting into and to get good outcomes once they've actually contracted with whichever part of the financial industry that they are dealing with. Our groups cover a very broad range of topics: pensions, banking, foreign exchange, investments, as I said earlier, governance, leadership. We've actually identified 25 different topic areas that we think the financial industry ought to be better at. And whilst we are sometimes constructively critical of the industry and the way that it works, our general intent is to be collegiate and constructive. We think that calling out bad practice is actually a good and healthy thing to do, especially if you can find a way of doing it in a reasonably collegiate and civilized way. And sometimes we do that. I hope that's enough all about the Transparency Task Force. I'm going to pass over to Jeff Houston, who'll introduce himself and then share his thoughts. I know that Jeff needs to disappear shortly after his session, so we won't be having Jeff for long. But Jeff, if I can please invite you to pick up the reins in just a moment. I'll briefly mention, just before passing over to Jeff, that if you do wish to use social media, please do so. It's always nice to tell people about what we're doing. I'll also mention that you'll feel free to link with each other through the chat, tell people a bit about yourself, share your views. Obviously, always do so in a collegiate and civilized way. And I think that's it. That's pretty much all the housekeeping points done. We'll now pass over to Jeff to introduce himself and pick up from here. Jeff, thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I said, yeah, I do need to shoot off, but I might hang around to listen to Chris. You know. I do remember I was on one of these a very long time ago. It was right at the beginning of all of this nonsense with online conferences, and it didn't go very well, Andy, if I remember rightly, because it was back in the early days when we didn't quite know how these things worked, and I'd obviously was on the wrong setting. So when I was trying to do a presentation, and all I could see on my screen was a great big picture of Andy. That's all. So I was basically just talking to Andy, who didn't know, so he just kept looking around all over the place. Anyway, let's hope it goes a lot better today. Yeah, so my name is Jeff Houston. I am the Secretary to the Local Government Pension Scheme Advisory Board and the Head of Pensions at the Local Government Association. I'm going to talk to you today for about 10 minutes about the Code of Transparency within the Local Government Pension Scheme. And a kick off just about talking a little bit about the LGPS. I've made a few notes that are sort of there. So when you see me looking downwards, it's not me ignoring you, it's just me referring to my notes. I still haven't figured out how to have notes up where I can see them on the screen without having to look away. So just a quick introduction to the Local Government Pension Scheme for those of you who don't know about it. Local Government Pension Scheme is actually three schemes. There's one in England and Wales, one in Scotland, and one in Northern Ireland. The Local Government Pension Scheme in England and Wales is 5 million members, about 17,000 employers, and in terms of assets is about £300 billion. So it's quite a big scheme. But as a hefty proportion of that is invested still in equities, because we are an open DB scheme, so we're still growing and moving forward, so can still take a significant amount of risk. We've got a lot directly invested in property, but a growing allocation to the alternatives world. So infrastructure, private equity, private debt. And we're getting into things like impact investment. So hi, Charlotte. And obviously the big thing on the agenda at the moment for the LGPS, like everybody else, is climate change and how we're going to deal with all the new regulations when that comes along. If we thought cost transparency was hard, wait until we get into this one. So that £300 billion is actually split across 86 funds within England and Wales. It's not all in one place. 86 funds. They range from just under £1 billion in value to the largest one, Greater Manchester Pension Fund, at around £25 billion. So big funds in their own right and a big scheme in its entirety. It's a DB scheme, as I said, but different to DB schemes in the private sector. It's not a trust-based scheme. It's a statutory scheme. The benefits are guaranteed in law and ultimately paid for, if it all goes horribly wrong, ultimately paid for by local taxpayers. Now, that's one of the reasons, and probably one of the major reasons, that we got interested in cost transparency in the first place. If your benefits are ultimately paid by local taxpayers, they're very interested in that and very interested in you making sure that you get the best value for the money that's going into them. It's also the reason that we have as our quasi-trustees local elected councillors. They are the decision makers in the LGPS. And again, another reason why they're very interested in costs within the scheme, because they are directly accountable back to those local taxpayers for what happens. Since 2018, we've been having a little experiment in what we call pooling. So those 86 funds now invest about 50% of their assets via 8 asset pools. So those asset pools act as collective investment schemes for those 86 individual funds. And there are a number of different models ranging from effectively asset managers that are owned by those local authorities to ones where they're bringing in expertise from the private sector on a procurement basis. But effectively, that's the money going through those pools out to the market. In terms of the asset managers that we use, when we first started off on this pooling process, we used about 300 managers, well, over 300 managers across those 86 funds. That's now down to just under 200. So pooling has already had an effect of bringing down the total number of managers being used by the LGPS. So that's the scheme itself. What about the Code of Transparency? The Code of Transparency was introduced in 2017 on the back of some work done by a number of people across the industry, including your next speaker. So Chris did an awful lot of work for us in that time. But also people like Colin Leach at Unison, who's a great proponent of cost transparency, and also some of the leaders of the councils who run those pension funds, who got very interested in seeing their investment costs only ever seem to go one way, and that was up and up and up. And they wanted to make sure that we were getting good value for that. So we introduced the Code of Transparency, which currently now covers about 150 of our 200 managers and 2/3 of the assets within the scheme. So considerable amount of assets and a considerable number of managers have now signed up. We're getting more signing up every day. Now that we've got the private market templates out there, we're seeing a lot of our private equity and private debt managers starting to sign up, whether they know what they're doing or not. They are still insisting on signing up. What the code does is it requires a manager to submit templates on a regular basis. That could be annual or it could be quarterly, without request. So it's not a situation where the LGPS client has to go to the manager and ask, can I have my template, please? If they sign up to the code, they have to submit those templates without request. and they go through them. It's a voluntary code, and it's an interesting voluntary code because it's entirely up to managers as to whether they sign up or not. However, lots of our funds and certainly the pools have now started using the Code of Transparency as part of their procurement process, and effectively saying to managers, if you're not a signatory to the Code of Transparency, you don't get on the list. So we will actually get managers coming along asking to sign up to the code who haven't even got any clients in the LGPS, because they know in order to get into the market, they will need it. So that's why we've got quite a lot of managers signing up. And obviously, as the pools came on board, lots of managers wanted to be managers for those big pools. So it was a great incentive for them to get signed up. What we give them in return is that they get listed on the Scheme Advisory Board website as being signatories to the code. So you can go on to lgpsboard.org. That's all one word, lgpsboard.org. Go into the cost transparency part and you will see all of the managers listed there. We also let them put on a little paragraph about how wonderful they are, and they get to use the Code of Transparency tick on all of their marketing materials. It's interesting, the most popular question we get from asset managers when they sign up is, how can we use the tick? How big can it be? Does it have to be in those colours? Very, very interested in basically being able to go out to the market and say, look at us, we've got the tick. In some ways, what is it? We've made honesty a competitive advantage, or at least we did when we first started this out. So what's happened since then? Since then, we've introduced a system. So this is an online system. So instead of the managers sending a template as an Excel spreadsheet to their clients, they upload it to a system. And that system is sitting there waiting for that template to arrive. It will take all of the CTI templates. It will also accept ILPA templates. We did have our own template, but that was only in for a period of time until those CTI templates came on stream. The system tracks the templates, waits for them. There is a 90-day period at the end of the period. So, for example, up until the 31st of March, which is when we're expecting them this year, they get 90 days to get those in. If they don't get them in by the 90 days, they are late, and they are marked as late on the system. We keep an eye on those, and in an extreme case, the Scheme Advisory Board could actually throw a manager off the code. And if we get to that situation, believe me, we would do it very, very publicly. So it's not in any manager's interest to get to a situation where they could be thrown off it. In terms of the system itself, it's extremely locked down. So as part of the Scheme Advisory Board Secretariat, I can only see the aggregated numbers. I can't see individual templates for individual managers or for individual funds. That's entirely their data, and only they can see that data. The LGPS clients themselves, the funds, they use the system so they can check that their templates have come in. They can see cost and performance summaries, and they can check themselves against the rest of the LGPS universe. So they can see where their costs can fit against the rest of the LGPS. They can also do that against their peers. So if they're a large fund within the LGPS, they can compare themselves to just the other large funds. We've added some functionality to it recently, and that was so it could accept templates in euros or US dollars, and it holds them in that original currency, but also does a currency translation for the purposes of doing comparative data. The other thing that we've done is that some clients came forward, and some managers actually, and said the 90-day period, we'd like it to be shorter. So some managers and clients have said, okay, well, let's have a shorter period instead of 90 days, 60 days, 30 days or whatever. And that resets the clock for the system so that their allowed time period then becomes 30 days or 90 days. And they can do that by mandate. So that's not for the whole manager. they can do that with the individual mandates that they set up. So where are we now in terms of the code itself? Well, so we've been running for a couple of years on the system. The first year was not the best one to be doing because we were looking to collect data for 1920, and we were looking to collect that data probably during the worst period you could do this with everything else that was going on last year. Regardless of that, we did get around 1,500 templates came through for 1920. And only 85 of those were more than 90 days late. So we got fairly good on that first year. That significantly increased both in terms of templates and in terms of some of the issues that we've seen for the year 2021. So they've just gone past the end of that 90-day grace period. That was the end of June. So where are we on then? We had 2,620 templates were actually due by the end of June. 25% of those are still outstanding. And when you look at that just as it is, you think, well, that's not very good. But then you look at it down a little bit more, in a bit more detail, and we can look, so I can look at it on the system and I can see where those are late against the asset classes and also against each manager, right? So where is the problem? The problem is in private equity. So the vast majority of those late in private equity, and of those, 80% are with two managers. So we had two managers to actually submit their templates, and suddenly we're back up into the 90% on time. So, and then for the rest of them, what we're seeing is that where you've got a situation of fund of funds, the top level manager is saying, I can't get my data from the underlying managers in time to get it to you within 90 days. So those seem to be the issues that we're seeing at the moment. Just finish off by talking about some work that there is still to do and work that we're thinking about doing. This is not just LGPS, but this is a CTI thing. The templates are good. They are good templates, but they do have issues. They are standard templates, and therefore, because of that, there is room for variation, shall I say, in what is supplied by managers. So we've got some work to do with the CTI in just trying to tie down exactly what managers should be putting in the data in each field. We've also got a job to do with our system to look at how we can better verify that data when it comes in, whether it's inconsistent or whether there are gaps, or whether it would appear to be that the manager is using a field in perhaps a way they shouldn't. So we've got some work to do, and I've got a meeting next week with the supplier of our system to see what more we could do in that area. As I said before, some managers could do better in terms of getting their templates in on time. As I said, it seems to be private equity and it seems to be restricted to a small number of managers, and we will be having some serious words with them over the next couple of weeks to get them to get their data in. On the fund of fund structures, we've got an interesting debate going on within the scheme at the moment. Is it a question that we just play hardball and we say to that top level manager, I'm sorry, you've signed up, it's your job to make sure that you get that underlying data in time? Or do we recognize this in some way and allow, with the agreement of the client, a longer time period? I had a meeting with some of the clients yesterday, and the view from them was, no, we stick with 90 days and we insist that the top level manager does a better job of getting that underlying data in. I think the other thing where the other place where we need to do a lot more work is in terms of the clients actually using the data. We need to make it easier for them to use the data. We need to give them a better reason to use the data. And we, to a great extent, need to involve consultants more when it comes to making use of that data, analysing that data, pointing out where the pension fund could be asking questions of their manager and maybe looking to strike a better deal. always get asked questions around, can the system do benchmarking? The system was never designed to do benchmarking. It is a compliance system that allows the clients within it to compare themselves within the LGPS. It could do benchmarking because we could share that data, but we can't without the permission of the data owners. So again, another conversation I had earlier this week was with some of those data owners, some of those pension funds saying, would you like us to actually start looking at that? It is an interesting one because the answer I got was, yes, but only if we know the answer before we ask you the question. So they would like to know how they compare before they ask us to do those comparisons. So lots of work still to do. It's been an interesting journey. I've been personally surprised but very grateful for how well the managers have responded to this, and I hope that they continue on with that. But I think we've got a lot more work to do on the asset owner side to get them to actually use that data a bit better. I will stop there and see if there are any questions. Thanks, Andy.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed. That was very clear indeed. If I may, I'll put a couple of questions to you before passing out to everybody else. Culture. What have you learnt about the culture, the range of different types of cultures within the asset management industry as a consequence of this exercise? Are you seeing quite a bit of variance? What does it range from to? What does it kind of tell you about the culture within the asset management sector?
It's, as you say, it's a range. So we've seen managers who jumped at this, who always wanted to be in this situation of getting costs front and center, who felt that there were some managers who were perhaps hiding costs and therefore looking better at the procurement point than they actually were when it came down to the ultimate costs throughout. In terms of signing up for the code, the interesting thing for us has been relationship managers sign up for the code and go, yeah, let's do that. And then their operational people go, how the hell are we supposed to do this?
Right.
So that certainly during the first year, that was a lot of it out there. The interesting thing for me on culture is on the asset owner side. There still appears to be some asset owners who just don't want to know this.
Amazing.
Now, I don't know whether that is because it would perhaps make them look as though they haven't done as good a deal as they could have done, or and then the other thing is there still seems to be the attitude that cost don't matter, it's only return. That still seems to be the attitude with some.
Thank you. And my second question relates to the future. How do you think this whole initiative could evolve and develop as time goes by? Ultimately, where do you think disclosure and costs can go for the local government pension schemes?
Well, I think we have to try and think about where we take the code of transparency next, because if you want to encourage asset managers, you have to get them into a place where they can have a competitive advantage. Once everyone's signed up to the code, that sort of goes away. So we'd have to develop the code and go on to code version 2 or something, which is going to ask some more of the asset managers in terms of either that level of detail or how often they send it. Yeah, so we have to keep pushing it forward.
And I'll squeeze one further question in, if I may, before passing it open to everybody else. The managers that for some reason don't want to sign up, what do you think or suspect might be the reasons for being like that? Why aren't they buying into it? Any ideas?
Some of them will be because of the regulatory situation they're in a home. So in terms of UK asset managers, we don't really have that much of a problem with the vast majority. Right. Some US managers just don't get it, to be perfectly honest.
Interesting.
And there are some small UK managers who just don't want to do it and say, well, that's fine. If you don't want to do it, then we won't use you.
Jeff, thank you very much. That's been extremely interesting. Let's pass it open to everybody else. I can see there's been a couple of questions put in the chat. Feel free to verbalise those questions. Just wave at me if you'd like to put a point or a question to Jeff. Just far away if you'd like to do that. It might be that was so clear that everyone's okay. I think Charlotte put a question in there about sustainable data. Charlotte, could you share that point for us?
So I actually was working for an asset manager at the time when these codes came out, and I was going desperately saying, we must put this in place, we must put this in place. And of course, all sorts of operational issues, terrible burden, can't quite do it. We'll have to wait for a while to get all the data together. So definitely seen it from the other side, and with the investment consultants as well. I suppose I saw this as a potential opportunity in another area where we're struggling for transparency and honesty, which is around sustainable investments, and the extent to which the kind of relative costs of pursuing sustainable investing could be reviewed using these templates.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a really interesting point going forward in terms of the whole aspect of sustainability, whether that's within climate or social or whatever. Those who are our trustees, so our elected members, constantly ask the question, is it still going to get me that return that I need? So any more information that we can get that either dispels the myth or proves the case for you can do both of those things. You can invest sustainably, low cost with good returns. The more data we can get on that, absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm going to invite Nikki Holtzhausen to ask the point that was made in the chat earlier around verifiability. I think Jeff did touch on this, but Nikki, please share your question and let's see what Jeff has to say around verifiability. Thank you, Nikki.
Many thanks, Andy, and good evening, Jeff.
Hi.
Many thanks for this discussion, and very impressed with the major steps that you've taken. I'm speaking from South Africa. I've done some work in trying to establish the fees. And as was mentioned, the fund of funds is tricky to really delve into, particularly the global fund of funds. And my question, as Andy indicated, is there a verifiability process or an audit process? Thank you.
Okay. I'm sure Chris will have something to say about this one. In terms of the way we do it, we would do it on it is for the manager to be confident that the information that they are sending us is correct. When they upload into our system, we ask them to check a box, and in checking that box, they state that the information that they are sending complies with all the regulations that they need to. Now, to a certain extent, that's going to work to a great extent for UK managers because the FCA is looking over their shoulder on this one. Obviously less in terms of managers abroad. Ultimately, I would think the only way you could possibly do this would be for systems to go into the back end of the data of the managers themselves. So there is a level of trust, but I'm sure Chris will talk to you about things like once you start collecting this data, you start to see where it looks a bit weird. So you can start to identify where particular managers are obviously outliers in costs in particular areas, because you can start to see what the average cost is for that type of product. Why is that one so different? So you can start to get a feel once you get that information starting to come through.
Yeah, quite agree, Jeff. But this is a really important point. But the most important point is this. You never take data from a manager if they're volunteering it. You only take data from them off the back of a request by a client. By a client, I mean an asset owner. And the reason is, I mean, there are lots of organizations out there that do benchmarking, and they have benchmarking clubs, and they take whatever the manager wants to give them and they accept it as real. And the manager can, in effect, say what they like because there is no regulatory requirement for them to be honest. When you are collecting data off the back of a client request, the largest sanction the FCA holds is for an organization that deliberately misleads its client. So the strongest sanction is if after the fact a manager is found out to have misled a client, and more to the point, a client has taken economic action off the back of it, the FCA will completely ruin that company. The sanctions are enormous. So that is a very strong incentive for managers to get it right. They get very anxious if you are requesting it on behalf of a client. And in fact, the most hoops that I have to go through as a company is ensuring that we are proving that our request is coming off the back of a client, because then they're legally held to give us the data. And now, of course, having oodles of data helps, because you can then back check it and test the hypothesis that they are in fact not either willfully or inadvertently misleading you. But think about that one thing. If every request comes off the back of a client's request, then the data by default will be the best data the manager can give you, because to fail to do so is a significant offence.
Thank you, Chris. Very interesting indeed. One further question for Jeff before I once again throw it open. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of work gone into this over several years. And of course, there have been years and years behind that. The ancestry of this goes back a long, long way. And again, Chris might touch on that when he speaks further. Given how much work has been done in the UK about this, are you seeing signs of other countries saying, you know what they're doing in the UK makes sense? Why don't we follow suit? Why don't we do the same or something similar? Is there any way to internationalize these templates so we have some best practice migrated to other parts of the world, Jeff?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I said Chris could probably comment on this more, because in the public sector world, we are strange by being funded. Most public sector pension schemes across Europe are not funded. They are pay as you go. So this is not a concern for them.
Got it. Thank you very much. Let's try it open once again. So I can now see everybody. Please wave your hand at me, either literally or digitally, if you'd like to put a point to Jeff. I can see we have Michaela. Briefly introduce yourself and put your point to Jeff. Thank you very much.
So I'm speaking a bit out of experience, because I did work as a risk manager for Canadian pension fund, for several actually. And I was in a position to look at the data awarded to external managers in order to build the risk reporting. So how do we include those amounts? Now I'm very much aware that probably transparency is very necessary to justify why do you choose that manager or that manager, because let us not forget, those managers to which the pension fund, the external ones, which have big hedge funds, they are going to be paid management fees. So you have to make sure that, the guy from the pension fund does not award the amounts to his friends in town that might then give him some kickbacks. So that's one issue for which, one can see why. Now, you said that the data behaves strangely. Let us not forget that in this hedge fund and these external managers, they do not have daily valuations. So it obviously underestimates the risk, right? You get only some points in time, which would be averages. So you actually forget all of the volatility, short-term volatility. Another point would be so what if I am working for a pension fund and I'm giving money to external managers, then I might decide for that or that manager, depending on the strategies they use, because in different situations in the economic cycle, I might say, oh, I want more emerging markets, or I want that or that type of strategy. Now, the problem is that these funds, how can I say, these strategies are not very well defined, number one. And the managers are very free, and usually they abandon the stated strategy in order for, if you can see, they can have some fast short-term returns, right? It's more important for them to make money than to follow a certain declared strategy. Another thing it is that when I was doing this, is you need data. They are these providers like HFR. So they are providers of data that have more like daily, or they interpolate. I don't know exactly how they create this data that you can use as a proxy for the real funds.
Thank you, Michaela. We'll hold it there, Michaela, in the interest of time. Thank you very much. Jeff, any quick comments in relation to what Michaela has said?
Yeah, just a couple of things on that in terms of choosing a manager for strategy or cost. You still choose the manager for strategy, but that doesn't stop you choosing the best manager within that strategy. And cost is one of the things that will point you towards the best manager in that strategy. The other thing I would say in terms of those managers who promise one thing and then deliver another, best way to find them is go and look in their costs, because that will give them away, whether it's transaction costs or FX costs or anything like that. That's the thing that will give them away, that they're not doing what you've asked them to do.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Does anybody have anything that itching to put to Jeff before we move on? It looks like we're good. So Jeff, thank you very much indeed. So you've got us off to a cracking start. Really appreciate it. Can we all show our appreciation to Jeff Houston? Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we're going to pass over to Chris Sier in just a moment. Before we do that, I'm going to mention the event we have on Thursday. Some of you may already know we have both a TGF film club and a TGF book club. The film club is all about watching movies relating to the finance industry, such as The Wolf of Wall Street, etc., and having a natter about them. We had a great one last night about a new documentary called The New Corporation. Highly recommended. It's actually not out on public release yet. We had a special pre-screening. But the reason I'm mentioning the book club, which is obviously about when we talk about a book, is because I'm very, very pleased to say that on Thursday of this week at 6 o'clock UK time, we've got this book by Robert Delner, who's an ambassador of the TTF. The title is Integral Impact Investments, Building and, excuse me, I need to make it a bit larger here. Building and, actually, Robert, I tell you what, I think you're with us, Robert. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your book and get the title right, because I can't see it on the screen. There we go. That wasn't planned, by the way, but it could have been a really nice segue. Robert, tell everybody about your book. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's basically called the Integral Impact Investment, the full spectrum approach to investment management.
That's it.
Which includes culture, by the way. So it's a topic we'll come back to, I'm sure, from time again.
Thank you very much. I'll put a link into the chat for those that want to attend that session. Highly relevant if you're into sustainable finance, responsible investing, the green economy, and all those other sorts of things. Thank you very much, Robert, for filling the gap there. Okay, let's go straight to Chris Sier. Before we do that, I think most of you know this. If you don't, the TTF quite literally almost definitely would not even exist if it wasn't for Chris Sier. I've got such warm, fond memories of a meeting in December 2014. God, it feels like a lifetime ago, when myself and Chris Sier and Con Keating had a conversation about these sorts of matters. And to cut this long story short, it ended up with the Transparency Task Force being conceived and created and launched and everything else. So always very, very grateful to Chris for his early days contribution in making the TTF happen. And of course, tonight in sharing his thoughts about transparency in the investment sector. So Chris, thank you very much. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. It's like you're blaming me for this, for which I sincerely apologise to all present. Right, so as usual, I've got too much to say and not enough to say it, and I prepared some slides, and as usual, there are far too many of them. I like numbers, so I want to give you some numbers. But first of all, I'll start off with some non-spoken numbers rather than numbers on a slide. So when I finished, somebody asked earlier, what was the genesis of the Code of Transparency? The Code of Transparency started after some conversations with between myself and Jeff and a few others on how we could enforce managers, a sort of a code, if you like, of conduct on managers to give data. There's a whole sordid, not even sordid, but a very lengthy journey that we went through. The Code of Transparency migrated itself into the wider sector through the FCA. I chaired the inquiry the FCA led on this. Jeff was on the panel. There were a number of other people who were on that panel. We created what then became this CTI template. And then off the back of that, having finished the work with the FCA, I built a company called Clearglass to act as a digital intermediary for the private sector, in the way that Jeff has something for the public sector for the LGPS clients. I do something somewhat similar for the private sector, but with more scope, because I'm not bound by the rules of the public sector, which I know can be extremely constraining. What it means is that that I currently now, after 2 years of doing this, or 2.5 years of doing this, I now service about 1,000 DB schemes, about 50 or 60 DC schemes for the cost collection using this CTI framework. Last year, we collected some 11,500 portfolios of data that we have tagged and classified into about 32 different asset classes. And we collected that data for those 1,000 DB clients from those 11,500 times, from something in the region of 431 when I last checked different managers. So there's a very, very long tail in the UK. The FCA estimates there are 1,750 asset managers that service the UK community. And to quote the FCA, that's far too many. How do we create a competitive environment where we can get rid of the bad and look at the good? So actually the database that we have, which is almost 1 trillion of assets, encompasses only 432 asset managers. Within those 1,000 pension funds, we have, I think when I last looked, something about 95 pension funds over 1 billion in size, which is basically every single pension scheme, DB pension scheme over 1 billion that isn't an LGPS scheme. So we have a very comprehensive database at the top end. And schemes over 100 million, there are, when I last looked, only 300 that we don't work with currently. The vast majority of the schemes that we don't work with are below 100 million. And actually the vast majority of those are below 50 or even 30 million. And there's a vast tail of very small DB pension schemes, 30 to 50 million in size, some 3,000 plus of them, that is very hard to get to. And I'm constantly trying to find ways to get in front of them, because we do provide a form of what I think is governance that they can get their teeth into. They can actually do something actionable about the information they receive. In terms of the tagging of the data, the 32 asset classes, Charlotte, to answer your question, we get to see the manager, the name of the strategy, how the strategy is considered by the client. As I said, we have our own nomenclature for the purposes of benchmarking. But I know several hundred instances of funds that have been tagged otherwise or something to do with ESG. Now, there are some subcategories within that. Some will be looking at forestry, some will be looking at renewable energy, some will be looking at other criteria to do with sustainability or impact. All I know is when I see anything that's tagged ESG, it comes with a price premium, full stop. And it's almost as if the word or the letters ESG or sustainability in the title automatically derive the right to add 20, 30, 40 basis points to what would otherwise be a perfectly normal fund. Now, that led me to the question, one simple question: if you're paying more for it, what are you getting? And I haven't seen really any way in which one can compare something which is not tagged with ESG to something that is tagged as ESG. And it brings to mind the efforts that we should all be making to establish principles of value for money for the asset management sector. Or assessment of value. And again, I'm going to put some slides up about that in a minute. But value for money is a very simple term for me. It's an equation. It's the value derived for the money you pay. You have to separate the two. You can't conflate them. And the biggest mistake that we have made in the industry is to allow the conflation of value for money into something called net performance, which is a funged total that makes no sense to anybody, because you cannot answer the question, how much more should you pay for how much more of the thing that you want to buy? If you're just looking at net performance, you can't derive the how much you pay part of it. So you have to separate the two. More to the point, you can't compare other levers of value. If you ask a trustee what is the thing they value in value for money, they'll say performance. But right now, they're also saying sustainability, ESG. And the fact that cost is in basis points and carbon footprint is in megatons of carbon, you can't combine the two. You have to have the cost broken out. So as soon as you move into a value for money environment that does not involve just purely performance, you have to break costs out. And if there's nothing else that you walk away from here, you have to have the costs broken out. It's as simple as that. So the efforts that we've gone have revealed some things. You may have seen a note in the FT. Chris Flood had a chat with me about 2 weeks ago and wrote an article on this. The best estimate that I've come up with for the capacity for cost improvement in the UK DB market is currently £6 billion a year. And I derive that purely from benchmarking data by size, by asset class, by fund type, seg versus pooled, which we have a segmentation for. And it also led me to be able to identify the managers. Again, we spoke earlier. Why would you pick a manager on cost? You wouldn't. You pick a manager for the manager that you would do the thing that you wanted it to do. And if it did the thing that you wanted it to do, you then ask yourself the question, what should I be paying for this thing? And then you'd negotiate your manager down to the point where they were reaching the market rate for the thing they're doing for you. So changing a manager is hard. It requires all kinds of costs. It requires all kinds of RFPs and complexity and scanning the market and tapping into a data set that comes almost uniquely from your pet consultant. And that pet consultant's view of the world is this big. It's not this big. So you get given a very thin slice of the world and you pick from that. Changing a manager is a difficult thing to do. But if you have a manager that's doing its job well, why not figure out what the price point is that it should be operating at and ask it to operate at that price point? So I'm going to produce some slides for you and show you the analysis that we did recently. So hopefully you can see something there that I'm calling it elite managers. Across our 32 asset classes, we identified across 19 of these asset classes a distinct group of managers that we felt delivered both best quartile costs and or best quartile performance simultaneously that you could rely on for a particular asset class. What I'll do is I'll pick one of these because I've got a lot of slides here. I've got 38 of them for each asset class and not 2 for each asset class. Here we have elite managers for global active equity. And there are some names here that you might recognize, and there are some that you might not. You might not be surprised to see names like Bailey Gifford, MFS, Wellington on here, but WCM, GTP, SGA, these are managers that are much smaller, but have delivered consistently top quality performance at the same time as best quality costs. In fact, our ranking system looks like this. For this particular asset class, we have 417 portfolios for 2019-2020 across 72 different asset managers, and we've been able to sort these managers into an order. And within that order, for both costs and performance, we have been able to demonstrate that these managers are either best quartile costs and best quartile performance simultaneously, or Q2 costs, Q1 performance simultaneously, or actually we'd also rank them as Q1 costs and Q2 performance simultaneously. Out of these 72 managers, there are only 4 that simultaneously have both Q1 performance and Q1 costs. Only 4 out of 72 managers for their clients across 417 portfolios delivered simultaneously best quality costs and best quality performance. And as it turned out, only one of them, we actually ranked them according to transparency as well. This magical factor that Jeff was talking about, which is honesty. We rank them according to this. We sort them, we order them, and only one of them simultaneously incurred both best quartile costs, best quartile performance, and best quartile transparency. 1 out of 72. That manager stands to gain a lot of praise for this. I'll make sure that people know about it. WCM Investment Management, well done. A very small manager. I think, are they part of the Bank of New York Mellon stable? Maybe they're not. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm doing them an injustice. Maybe that's Walter Scott and Partners. But the point is, it's a small manager and it's standing up and facing down not just the Bailey Giffords of the world, which also did well, but a range of much larger managers, in fact, 71 other managers. Now, as I say, we can do this for almost any of the different asset classes that you look at. Passive equities global. You know, you've got State Street Global Advisors and Robeco. No surprise about State Street Global Advisors. But we can do that. And what it does, we actually offer them now this particular logo. It's the equivalent of the signing up to the Code of Transparency thing that we do for the private sector, the managers that service the private sector. You know, you can get a number of stars. It's a good thing. They can use it in the marketing. Well, hey. But that's not the important point. The point is that it's possible to calculate based upon the journey from the interquartile range, from worst quartile costs to best quartile costs. It's possible to calculate how much the market could negotiate themselves down if they all operated at the threshold of best quartile cost. And the answer is £6 billion. Now, here's the downside. The downside is anything that's recognized as a saving for the asset owner is recognized as a revenue loss for the asset manager. Now, you can imagine they're not happy about that. Well, not all of them, because there are managers out there who can deliver best quartile costs and best quartile performance already. These are the ones that we call elite managers: Aegon Asset Management, Brockton Capital, CBRE for Real Estate UK. So they don't have to change their business model to operate at the threshold that the market would deem as reasonable. And if you do the calculation, this small coterie of managers, and there are 66 of them, this small coterie of managers actually stand to gain £3 billion of revenue. That's how much money they stand to gain, and the industry will still save £6 billion worth of cost, or 30 basis points. So the flip side here is there are a lot of managers out there that are not doing a good job, and there are some that are doing a very good job. And the ones that do the good job, if people operate at that threshold, they stand to gain £3 billion of revenue. It is the mechanism the FCA first asked me to look at, which is figure out how we can reduce the number of managers and make the environment more competitive. It is the competitive mechanism. And on that, I'm going to talk to you about the assessment of value framework. Last week was not a good week for asset managers. The assessment of value framework is the FCA's approach to forcing asset managers within their bailiwick, which are predominantly the managers that offer authorized funds, i.e. retail funds, to report last year using a framework defined by the FCA, specifically on quality of service, net performance, costs, economy of scale, benchmarking, share classes, and comparable services. Now, as it turned out, the FCA looked at this first year of report and considered it to be woeful. If you read their report, it was released last Monday, Tuesday. The assessment of value framework, the assessment of value reporting by managers was panned, largely because managers were marking their own homework. That was at least one of the reasons why the FCA gave. Now, it just so happens that we, and Jeff to a certain extent as well, actually does the first 5 of these things for the institutional world. No one's asked the institutional managers to report on assessment of value, but actually we can offer an assessment of value report that isn't managers marking their own homework. We're doing it independently because we calculate quality of service, net performance, costs, economies of scale, and we do benchmarking. We actually now have transparency added on there as well, and we're starting to do ESG screening as well, and I'll talk about that if people want me to. But the point is, it's very easy to construct, based upon the CTI templates, a form of assessment of value that is independent and doesn't rely on managers marking their own homework. So it's pretty unique. Now, there's something else that the data can tell you, which is really important. I think the estimate of 6 billion is one thing. That's exciting, right? Being able to figure out that there's £6 billion of potential capacity in the market, but I want a more accurate calculation. And for that, I need to work for every single pension fund out there to calculate their costs. Or do I? Now, the simple truth is, all I really need to be able to calculate the median costs, and by median, I mean the expected costs, and the potential costs, which are the best quartile costs, is the asset allocation and the asset classes as defined by any particular pension fund. And it turns out that that information is held within annual reports or SIPs. So I'm going through a process right now of downloading annual reports and SIPs, scraping this data on asset allocation. All I need is the name of the type of the fund and the asset allocation, and I can preemptively calculate what they should be paying and what they could be paying. So here's an example. This is a live example, and actually it's a live client example, and I'll show you the results in a moment. But here we have the median costs based on this asset allocation and this set of asset classes. The median total cost was 122, and the ongoing charges were 38 for that pension fund. The best quartile costs, if one applied the best quartile data, was 58 basis points and 22 basis points respectively. But the best part is we actually have this organization as a client, and that is what they're actually paying. What they're actually paying was 78 basis points and 40 basis points. And now those two numbers respectively represent either a 2.5 million or a 2.3 million pound cost saving if the manager can negotiate those, if the pension fund can negotiate those managers down to that level. Now, we can do the first two of these things, median and best quartile, for any pension fund that has publicly or wants to send me their asset allocation and their asset classes. So one of the things we're building at the moment is an online tool. People will be able to go online, pick the asset classes, pick the asset allocation, and automatically have calculated what the expected costs would be, median values, and the best quartile costs would be, which would be what you could achieve through negotiation. So once we've done that and we can do it for the entire market, we will actually know what the capacity in the market is and how close my £6 billion calculation is. But if it's not higher than £6 billion, I'd be surprised. I'll leave it there, Andy. I think I've probably spoken enough, and I'm sure there are plenty of questions.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That really was very interesting. I'll kick off, if I may, with a couple myself, and then we'll throw it open. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. It seems to me that the work you're doing is giving the asset owners the weaponry, the data to enable them to negotiate better than they've ever been able to do that before. To what extent are the asset owners that you're dealing with using this data to negotiate better terms? Is it just like one in a blue moon, or are they also realizing that because of the data they can now negotiate more strongly and more firmly than they've ever done before?
Well, the first question to ask yourself is, you can negotiate with any asset manager, but the ones you want to negotiate with are the ones that you actually are getting a good service from already. So predominantly around performance, if they are delivering top quartile performance, negotiate with them over costs if their costs are high, because all you're going to get then is reduced cost and free performance.
Right.
If the manager is bad at everything, it's probably time to look at another manager. It's very hard to improve performance. If you are consistently underperforming, it's very hard to turn to the manager and say, we need another 5 percentage points of performance. What are they going to do? They're trying their hardest already. Costs is a freebie. And because it's a freebie, you should always negotiate it. And the only way to negotiate it is to know what you're paying and know what the market is paying. That's just an absolute given. What was the other part of the question, Andy? Sorry.
It's about the extent
negotiation.
to which,
Yeah, I'll give an example. The best example I know is our friend Robert Waugh from RBS, or NatWest as it is now. Robert is on record as saying, and Robert's one of my clients, right? So his data, we've got him his data, right? He's on record as saying that since he started collecting data using the CTI template, he's reduced his costs from 50 basis points to 20 basis points. That 30 basis point reduction on 51.7 billion pounds is something like 150 million pounds a year of cost reduction realized by the RBS pension scheme.
Right, that's really significant. Thank you, Chris.
It's huge.
And secondly, before we pass open to everybody else, the gold star, so to speak, for the transparency column, what does a manager need to do for you and your firm to kind of accredit them with that star? We've
got a number of levers. We make it as quantitative as possible. So we take out the opinion of individuals. There has to be an element of, if the manager is really rude to us, it's probably, they've got to understand we're acting on behalf of a client. So, they're being rude to a client here, and we will feed back any just really, how can I put it, just rude comments straight to the client. So the client gets to see them. There's full transparency. But it involves, when you asked for the data, when did you deliver the data? Did that match the client's expectations? The client gets to set the date of when the data has to be delivered. So actually the manager often goes back to the client and says, I can't do it in that time frame. And if the client comes back and says, fine, we've reset the date, but we have a platform, right? We're a technology company. They go into the platform and set exactly what it is they want by when they want it within the platform. And then everything else is automated after that. We have to do some manual chasing, but as long as the manager returns data within the threshold, that's one. Mm-hmm. That's a pass. The second thing is the data has to be formatted correctly. Right. The propensity for managers to take what is an absolutely standard template and do something stupid, like put an extra line in at the top so that their brand is in the extra line, that's fine. Normally, if you were a person doing this, you would look at that and say, that's fine. We have a platform, and an extra line screws up the automation process of the upload. Sorry, this is supposed to be an automated process. You're supposed to be doing it automatically. Fail. If the data is in the wrong format, fail. If the wrong cells are being completed, and there's an internal logic that we built into the CTI templates, conditional formatting everywhere, A plus B plus C should equal 100%. If that plus that does not equal that, fail. Managers have to follow the logic. There are input cells, there are calculation cells, there are output cells. If the manager fails to do that, it's a fail. It's not complicated stuff. So all of that stuff goes into factoring how transparent they are. If they do it cleanly, sweetly, efficiently, no problems, no holdups, they're given the best score, and then the scores are ranked from 1 to 422 per asset class, and managers are given a quartile rating according to those scores.
Thanks, Chris. Just before we go to Mark Northway, then to Martin White, I imagine the managers who don't get the tick in the box for transparency first time round quickly learn the mistake, and hopefully you're seeing some changes in behaviour, Chris?
Are you trying to drag me into a debate about certain large managers that didn't do a very good job recently? There was an article in the FT in January. A certain journalist did her homework very well and went to clients and went to asset managers and figured out the managers that I've always been happy to praise managers because I recognize with kids, that the best way to get kids to do something is not to shout at them, but to encourage them when they do something well and maybe make a little grumble when they've done something badly. But if you constantly tell them they're doing something wrong, it makes them very unwilling to do things. And I don't want to compare managers to children, but actually that's just simple behavioral psychology 101, right? So I've always resisted putting out the names of the bad managers who have been unwilling to do this. But this journalist did her homework and then hit me with the names. And they were published. And since then, every single one of them has dropped off that naughty list, except for one, and that is Aegon UK.
Right.
And Aegon UK hasn't dropped off the list because actually it's a platform, and platforms still don't get it. I don't care which platform it is, they don't understand what transparency is about, and there is a big journey they have to now go on.
Thank you, Chris. I think I've just found that article. I'll pop it into the chat.
Thank you.
Welcome. Mr. Mark Northway, please introduce yourself and then put your point to Chris here. Thank you.
Hi, Mark Northway. I'm sort of double legging with, I'm working for an asset manager as Paris Capital, and I'm also chairing the share SOC. Chris, your data, which is fantastic, clearly underlines the FCA's conclusion that the competitive pressures are not working properly in the market. What's your explanation for that?
What are component pressures? Sorry?
Competitive pressures are not working properly in the market. They're not driving prices.
Purely a lack of transparency. Let me give you two anecdotes from last week, because is it like maybe even yesterday, but let's just say within the past 7 days. A manager that we've rated very highly in a number of categories, both for transparency and for its cost and performance, it candidly admitted that although it sees itself as the UK's low cost manager, has never, ever, ever had any empirical evidence to prove the fact. So it's never had any data to prove the fact. That there is and has been for some time, but you can't have competition without information. If you can't properly compare A to B, then there is no competition. And I would ask you to think about the difference between the granularity and depth of data that's currently being collected using the CTI framework and the previous environment where everyone was conflating costs and performance as a net performance number. There was no transparency. There was no way to break these things out. There was no competition. That's the situation. It's a fantastic piece of insight from the FCA. I mean, I never put it as a competitive thing. I never thought of it. I just wanted to have the data because I resented the fact that whenever I went asking for what I thought was reasonable, I was rejected in my request. You don't need that data. Who are you? We're going to sue you. Well, don't sue me. It just makes me angry. And that's probably a bad idea because I tend to be very determined about these things. All of this really has come from a number of early interactions with the Investment Association and asset managers that were very, very ugly back in 2007. That's kind of where it started. And if, as a former policeman, someone says no to me, I want it more. And if they threaten me, it means I know they're up to something and I'm up to no good and I want it. I didn't think of it as a competitive thing. I never did. But now there's a competitive tension in the market. If you've got two managers that deliver exactly the same performance and one is really expensive, which one are you going to go for? You need to know these things. Exactly the same performance, they do everything the same, but one costs twice as much. Which one do you pick? I would pick the cheaper one. Why? Because costs are constant.
But in the institutional space, you had a body of experts that was supposed to be bringing precisely that transparency, and that didn't seem to work.
Which body of experts are we talking about here? Trustees and or consultants?
Consultants.
Well, okay. So consultants. I'll give you a little couple of stories about consultants. I like consultants. They want to do the right thing, but they're peering into a very small pond. There are 20 consulting organizations in the UK. 3 of which are mega. They have about 50% of the market. But the point is, they only peer through the lens of the market they see. So to give you an example, I was approached by a pension fund friend of mine. It's a client, but they're a very good friend of mine. And she said, we've decided to put a mandate to market for infrastructure. And our consultant has recommended 2 managers for the RFP. I cannot believe they've only recommended 2. There must be more managers out there. My response was, well, which 2 have they recommended? And when she told me, I said, well, I wouldn't have recommended those. That's not what our data shows. But more to the point, there are 57 managers that I recognize from our data set that do infrastructure. Why have they only recommended 2? So I just gave her the full list of 57 and said, these are the top 5. Because I see that. And the consultants, with the best will in the world, when they were asked about this, they said, well, we recommended 2 because we were given 5 by a manager selection team. And the manager selection team have only looked at 10 out of 57.
Yep.
Now, diversified growth funds, an even worse example. RFP, 5 managers, diversified growth fund. I spoke to the consultant and said, why do you pick those managers? I don't understand why those managers are on the RFP. And the reason the conversation came about was because a client from 2 years before, last year, was coming back to us, and we've been warned there would be a new manager we'd be collecting data from, because we're told who we're going to be collecting data from, right? So there's a new manager, don't go to that manager, go to this manager, or go to one of these 5 managers, Chris. Why those 5 managers? Well, those are the ones we were told by a manager selection team. How many managers did they pick from? Well, they've got a short list of 10. And how many did they go to get that short list of 10? Well, I believe in the UK, there are no more than 25 managers that do diversified growth funds. Wrong. There are 75. And those are just the ones that I know about.
Thank you. What a full answer. Just before we go to Martin, a kind of related point, Chris. I've often heard from youngish, boutique, niche managers who frankly complain that the big investment consultant firms won't even consider them for their clients, despite the fact that they may have a very strong proposition. Are you finding that this activity that you and others are creating to shake up the market and make it more transparent, more competitive, is that a good thing for young boutique players coming into the market who believe they've got something to offer?
It's good for anyone that puts data in the market. I will give you the example of BlackRock, okay? And I know they're not a young boutique manager. BlackRock was causing trouble giving data, and yet they've won more, or they have come top in more categories than any other manager. And we wouldn't have been able to do that or put them in that categorization if they hadn't given us the data. There is nothing to be frightened of in giving the data. In answer to your other question, is there an opportunity for smaller managers? Yes. I'll give you 2 anecdotes, right? I'm full of anecdotes, Andy. I've got them up to here. But approached by a European manager that wanted to know why they were never included in RFPs for a certain consultancy.
Yeah.
And my answer was, well, I don't think you can be part of their pick list. How do we get on their pick list? How do we get as part of their selection group? And the answer is, well, I don't know. I guess you got to go and really butter up the consultants till they notice you, or go to conferences and put lots of material out. As it turns out, a more effective mechanism was to give us data, because when we looked at the data for the limited number of clients they're working with in the UK, they're doing a fantastic job. So now they can talk about themselves in the context of, we're compared to the market, not just the consulting market. And hopefully, rather like the example for infrastructure, they will get the opportunity to get lobbied onto a list directly by a trustee, rather than through the less efficient mechanism of give me your pre-selected favorites, Mr. Consultant.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you. And another quickie before we go to Martin, if I can. How does your system, how does Cleargas cope with fund managers who use performance-related fee structures of one kind or another?
So we collect the data like any other. So for me, for the past 3 years of data we've collected, very few managers that aren't hedge funds, private equity, infrastructure, or property have accrued any performance fees. There is a negative correlation in every asset class apart from those 4 between performance and cost. The more you pay, the less performance you get. That's a very clear correlation. Sometimes it's steep, sometimes it's steeper, sometimes it's shallow, sometimes it's steeper. Yep. The only asset classes where there is always the more you pay, the better the return, are the ones where there's a hard-coded internal rate of return in there. And that is private equity and infrastructure and property. And unfortunately, what actually happens is in the long term, there has to be a rebalancing of that accrued interest, of that, I forgot what the word looking for is, the accrued interest that is effectively the bonus payment they receive. So there is a problem. If you ask me a question, and I'm going to rhetorically pose it to myself, what is the long-term, multi-year, year-on-year return and cost of private equity? It's 11% net and 5% costs total. So that is across a data set of 125 different managers, 1,200 portfolios of data from every stage of a life cycle of a pension fund, of a private equity fund. And I'm just taking the information that we've got across those 1,200 portfolios and averaging it. And what you end up is you get all stages of the J curve averaged out as a graph that looks like this, which has a gradient of 11% performance and 5% cost. So ask yourself the question, 11% performance, 5% cost, the FTSE long-term return is 8.5% performance, and you can access the FTSE for basis points.
Wow. That's really, really powerful.
Doesn't defeat private equity, by the way, because private equity do have a significant lack of correlation that is useful for portfolios.
Got it.
So if you're going to buy private equity, don't buy it for return, buy it for other things. That's my assessment anyway.
Right, for diversity. Let's go to Mark. Go on, Mark.
Carried interest was what you were looking for.
Thank you. Carried interest, not accrued interest. Carried interest, apologies. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chris. Let's go to Mr. Martin White. Martin, please introduce yourself and put your points to Chris.
Okay, jolly good. I'm an actuary by trade, but I'm interested in changing the world we're discussing now, and I'm one of the people who set up the UK Shareholders Association years ago. So that's the hat I'm wearing mainly. But what we just talked about reminded me of an earlier life. Up until 1988, I was working in a consulting firm, pensions consulting firm, actuarial firm, and I used to get involved in grilling fund managers. I loved it. However, when we chose fund managers, I think we did a truly appalling job. We looked at their performance over a relatively recent period. And funnily enough, that's what the actuarial textbook seemed to say. They said, oh, pick somebody who'll get good quarterly performance each time, and it rolls up magically wonderful answer. But I know that these things have to be looked at over a much longer period. So my question, Chris, and this is what cropped up when I read the FT article, is over what period are you judging performance, and therefore to what extent is it meaningful?
I make no judgment on performance. I judge managers on other factors. If you want my personal opinion on how I pick my own personal managers, it's got nothing to do with performance. It's got everything to do with cost and behavior. Because the one thing that you can determine is that costs will stay constant when performance won't, and culture, it changes very slowly. Okay. So there isn't a manager that I will work with that's dissed me in the past. If you've been rude to me, I'm not going to touch you, not with a barge pole. If you've been rude to someone I know or like, I'm not going to touch you. Yeah. If your costs are high, I'm not going to touch you. Yeah. Now,
in the material you've shown, we had a column for performance and top quartile, et cetera, but you didn't talk about how significant the performance was compared to the expenses. And what you're saying now is what I sort of expected.
I to be fair, I can do that, but I'm not going to. That's called benchmarking data. And benchmarking data for me is hugely commercial. It's the only way that I really can keep my company afloat. So I'm giving as much as I can without giving away effectively the crown jewels of what we do. So, it's fine. Go out and collect the data, build a company, run it yourself, mortgage your house, put your family at risk, and then give the data away for free. Go for it. And I will support you. But I'm not going to do that. I've got 30 people in my company whose mouths I have to feed, and I have to look after my own family. Okay. We do things as much as we can at as low a cost as possible because we want to be a utility. But the only way that we can actually make money to keep ourselves afloat is by making it commercial in some way. So we can't, I'm not going to tell you that data. What I will say to you is this, is that although the performance data is seen through the lens of 1 year, managers who routinely have the best costs and best behavioral characteristics do routinely deliver the best performance. There are all kinds of things that I could measure if I could had the capacity that I would say are far more reliable judges of long-term performance and relationship with an asset manager other than performance. Cost is one of them. It's like I say, within an asset class, there's a negative correlation in almost every single asset class, apart from the ones I mentioned, between performance and cost. What that tells me is because cost is constant, pick on cost, not on performance.
Yes, thank you. Thank you
Great.
very much indeed, Chris, for a really great session. We're going to be moving on shortly, of course.
Charlotte had a question. She had her hand up several times. I saw her hand go up and down like that, but
I didn't see that. Let's go to Charlotte.
Yeah, I wanted to pull on I was going to ask you to what extent you've looked at fiduciary management, with any of your clients, and obviously the layering there. And obviously, in relation to the point about investment consultants, I work for an investment consultant, I've worked for fiduciary manager, I've worked for asset managers. That's part of the reason why I now work for an independent organisation. What I was going to say is that internally, they've got a conflict, obviously, that was brought out as part of a CMA review, but not least of which it creates a problem because their traditional consulting model is then being competed against by their fiduciary management model, which they then leverage far more of a profit from. And so therefore they have no incentive to spend huge amount of money or resources on manager research. And that's the big difficulty there.
They do and they don't, because I got some fiduciary clients, and what I do know is they get extremely vexed with managers that are part of their fiduciary portfolio that won't give data.
Yes.
The irony of it is that one of our fiduciary clients had used the same managers it had recommended to its consulting clients, and they wouldn't give data, and realized when it came to it that actually the fact that that these managers wouldn't give data to defined benefit clients also meant they probably wouldn't give them data for their fiduciary business, and there was uproar. Hedge fund managers basically. Yes. And there was uproar, and they dealt with it. They dealt with it abruptly, swiftly, brutally, and in every way, a way that made me happy, because brutality is part of my nature. It made me extremely happy to see the way they dealt with the managers. I understand that I am on the hit list of a number of hedge fund managers in the US. And from what I understand, there is a recording that is in circulation at the consultant that if I got hold of it, I would be able, in their own words, to sue the manager for defamation anywhere that I wish to choose to do so. But they're not going to give me that, even though I've asked them for it. I've begged them for it. I would love to have it, if only to have a laugh at the extent at the expense of the hedge fund manager. Anybody that gets that vexed about it is definitely doing something wrong.
Charlotte, thank you. Chris, thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation to Chris before we move on to our next speaker, Mark Northway. Chris, thank you very, very much. We all appreciate that. Thank you.
I need to go and cook for my family now, so if you don't mind, I'll have to drop off. I'm sorry about this. It's taken longer than I expected.
This is what you meant about keeping all those mouths fed, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Very good. Very
Thank
good.
you very much.
Thanks a lot. Nice one, Chris. Cheers. Let's go straight to Mr. Mark Northway. So, Mark, over to you, sir. Please tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your firm and the context, and then dive into what it is you'd like to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was terrified when I saw that I was following Chris Sier, because I knew there was going to be some duplication in what I was going to say. But I'm at least pleased that I'm only the third to speak, because I think if I were later, it would be worse. As I mentioned before, I'm involved with an asset manager. It's an allocator more than an asset manager in passive world, really looking to put together high performance, low cost portfolios using index instruments. It has a factor-based approach and an ESG approach, and that is all it does. So the clients are effectively either profit motivated or conscience motivated. I know that's a contentious suggestion, but that's at least the way that we see it. And then I'm involved with ShareSoc, which is, Martin has that AXA and ShareSoc is the sort of twin sister of AXA, looking after the interests of individual investors. And from that perspective, I get involved in the likes of governance, but transparency really crosses them both. I do have a couple of slides. So what's going on in the funds world? And I think on the regulatory development side, and there's going to be a little bit of crossover here, the high level development is the battle between principles and rules. There is a regulatory pendulum which swings between high level principles and detailed prescriptive rules. To some degree, the point on the arc at any one time is a function of how badly things have gone wrong in the recent past. And following the global financial crisis, we find ourselves clearly in rule-based territory. labouring under what Forbes magazine has described as MiFID II's 30,000 pages and 1.5 million paragraphs. At some point, regulation by rules becomes impenetrable to all bar a handful of compliance specialists. And more worryingly, rules are by nature formulaic. And if bad behaviour is not specifically constrained by the wording, then it's deemed by some market participants to be acceptable. And when that happens, there's a clear need to revert to a more principle-based approach. There appears to be a regulatory initiative afoot to produce an interlocking mix of principles and rules, as evidenced by the consultation on consumer duty. And I suggest that that's a good thing, although it's not still not clear how we untangle the current regulatory spaghetti to make it more accessible to practitioners and consumers. There's a focus on value. Much focus has been placed on it over the last few years, and the regulator has produced very useful data through its asset management market study 2017, highlighting poor value delivery, closet indexing, and ineffective competition that we spoke about just now. This increased transparency has resulted in cost reductions throughout the value chain. Fund managers, allocators, platforms, and to a lesser degree, advisors. There is still room for further improvement, particularly in delivering the cost benefits of scale and technology to the underlying consumer. Recent focus has been of fund assessments of value, and Chris spoke about this. This initiative is more contentious as it relies on fund managers assessing their own output or marking their own homework, as he put it, using subjective measures. The value equation has quality, which is in this case performance, and service as the nominator and price as the denominator. And AOV reports, where they can be found, and it's an interesting point that the worse a manager's value is, the more difficult it is to find the AOV report anywhere on his website, inevitably wax lyrical about service, where, as is most often the case, the fund has failed to beat its benchmark. This process will undoubtedly become still more muddled as managers point to ESG credentials as another reason for downplaying the financial outcome. Consumer duty, TTF is all over this, and many of you will have listened to the excellent symposium last week. At first sight, this is an attempt by the FCA to strengthen the regulatory framework and to place the consumer clearly in focus. A question is whether the proposal does actually create a legal duty of care and whether this brings with it a public right of action. The ability for consumers to sue directly, and I'm conscious of Paul Bates in the audience, as opposed to the ability for the regulator to punish, is a two-edged sword. Class legal redress suits undoubtedly focus the minds of product providers, but restraint is required to prevent frivolous cases where the primary beneficiary is the sponsoring law firm and or funder. Illiquid assets, it's been a mess. Liquidity mismatches are very dangerous and can result in a range of investor harm, ranging from the inability to access and liquidate capital to devastating loss of savings through forced fund closure. Recent examples include the open-ended property funds twice, first following the Brexit vote, and then secondly throughout the COVID pandemic, and of course the Woodford Equity Income Fund debacle. Holding illiquid assets in an open-ended fund is pure folly, particularly where that fund is branded UCITS, the gold standard. The property funds at least were classed as NURS, non-UCITS retail schemes, but even they were permitted to offer daily liquidity against fundamentally non-liquid real estate. The proposal is to create a new class of fund, the LTAF, long-term asset fund, specifically intended to hold illiquid assets such as real estate, private equity, and private debt, to allow such funds to offer bespoke redemption terms which take account of the nature of the assets, and to restrict ownership, at least initially, to institutional investors. The proposal is, to my mind, flawed in three areas. Firstly, it perpetuates the folly of holding fundamentally illiquid assets in an open-ended structure. Secondly, it fails to specify the basis of acceptable redemption terms. And thirdly, it ignores the jewel in the crown of the UK's investment management universe, the investment trust. High-risk promotions, another difficult area. The thrust of the proposal from the FCA is threefold: improving the definition of high-risk investments, improving the information and level of transparency available to consumers, and creating sophistication and/or net worth hurdles to protect unsophisticated investors. All three are worthy goals, but the latter, differentiation between unsophisticated and sophisticated consumers, requires careful handling. Identifying well-informed, sophisticated private investors is already problematic and excludes many participants from access to appropriate products, services, and information. Traditional methods include an assessment of trading or investment experience and an assessment of net worth. There may be value in introducing an investor qualification based on examination, which would go some way towards improving the level of financial education in the UK. Market developments. I mentioned Woodford and the property funds from the regulatory perspective. In terms of market development, it is to be hoped that these act as cautionary tales and persuade the fund management industry to pay more attention to the appropriateness of the wrapper in which they place assets. The current market structure incentivizes managers to produce vehicles which will produce AUM for them, assets under management for them, assets under management, equating, of course, to revenue. And that means open-ended daily liquidity funds, and damn the risk. We need to build a consensus approach between managers, markets, investors, and where relevant, consultants and advisors that looks through the chimera of daily liquidity and understands the importance of wrapper selection and liquidity matching. As mentioned, the cost of investing has been falling. A study in October last year by the Langcat concluded that there's a further 30 basis points, which fortunately matches exactly Chris Sier's number, to come from fund OCFs, 10 basis points from allocators, 7 basis points from platforms, and 20 basis points per annum from advisors. That is 67 basis points per annum to look forward to and to press for. But undoubtedly, the biggest sea change in the investment world recently has been a huge increase in focus in ESG. This focus from governments and investors alike is pervading management styles, practices, and portfolios, and is reflected in due diligence processes and investment analysis. That does bring its own set of risks and concerns, as managers, again often driven by marketing forces, rush to abandon tried and tested investment philosophies to jump on the bandwagon of responsible investing. We shall see. That's my lot. Brief and to the point, I hope.
Beautifully done. As if we had been spending weeks planning that. Your last comments on the ESG is going to dovetail perfectly into what Charlotte will be speaking about shortly. As if we planned it, Mark. That was great. Excellent. Thank you very, very much. You've given us a nice sort of whistle stop tour through lots of the issues in the industry right now, and it's great that you're as on top of them as you are. Thank you. Any comments or questions, folks, for Mark Northway? Okay, it looks like we're pretty comfortable.
I hope I frightened everybody into submission. That's great. Oh no, Martin, come on.
We can always rely on Martin. Over to you, sir.
You goaded me into it, Andy. The ESG, so much hot air, so much value signaling, so much extra fees, but how much thought is being given to, let's call it, culture and behavior within companies?
When you talk about companies, are you talking about investee companies?
Absolutely, investee companies.
Well, I think it depends on the ESG approach. One of the problems that faces the industry is that at the moment there's an assumption that a manager has to have full religion in order to run an ESG fund, and I don't think that's correct. I think a manager has to have science and data to run a fund. And the allocation process is driven by that science and data. The culture process, and this is where all asset managers do have to have religion, is in the engagement that underpins. So there's always two means of influencing a company. One is by removal of capital or increasing capital or allocation of capital, and the other is through voting and engagement. In our world, or in the world in which I'm involved, it's quite difficult because we're purchasing ETFs and index funds, and therefore have no direct exposure to the underlying fund. So we are effectively doing due diligence on the engagement and stewardship processes of the fund managers, which are poor. And there are some very large fund managers who are overly reliant on the perks and the ISS of this world to do it for them. Some large managers who are declaring themselves to be hugely focused on this area, but who have appeared in the Financial Times this week in terms of noticeably voting their shares in favour of their paying corporate customers, rather than in favour of the shareholder interest. So it's that whole controlling the culture of the underlying company. The UK is an outlier because the UK, I think it's been a bit of an excuse rather than a real tendency. But the UK says, well, I'm not going to allocate according to responsible criteria, but I am going to engage responsibly. And actually, it's been fluff. There hasn't been a huge amount of engagement underneath it. But in terms of the global tendencies, we are the country that most focuses on that stewardship process.
Interesting. Thank you. And I get, Andy, we're having an event before too long on the governance issue, and I think a lot of interesting issues to come out. Take those further.
Indeed. In fact, the next one we've got relating to this topic generally is an event called the case for radical reform of the audit profession. We've got some real concerns over the effectiveness of the audit profession, but that's another matter. I think we're going to move swiftly on. Mark, so clear that we're all comfortable with what you've explained. Thank you very much indeed. Of course, let's show our appreciation to Mark. And as we're doing so, let's invite...
Sorry. I'm so sorry. It's Rebecca Healy. Could I just... I apologise. I apologise for my attire. I'm in quarantine in a hotel in Greece, so I apologise.
You look fine.
Basically, Mark, thank you very much for that. That was I'm slightly casual, but thank you very much. That was very interesting, Mark. Do we think, though, we've got to the stage where actually ESG is just talked about too generally? And, you know, it really needs to now be sort of broken down into the different components. I mean, for example, I do a lot of interviews with asset managers, and one of the things that has struck me is if you're talking to somebody who's been embedded in ESG, I don't know, for the last 20, 30 years, they wouldn't have touched Tesla with a barge pole. Whereas actually sort of Tesla's obviously been some of the big highlights and has done particularly well in the last year on the back of sort of the ESG focus. And I think there's that point. The second point is when you talk about ESG data, you know, a lot of the data that is currently available is a year old and it's backward looking. Yep. That makes it very difficult for asset managers to actually make effective decisions. So hence they're moving to alternative data providers that are much more model based. And the third point that I had is actually we're all learning as we go. You know, what we thought we knew about ESG, we don't. And the classic example that was given to me is, you know, you invest in alternatives to meat, only to discover that soya is the second largest source of deforestation. So actually, there's a bigger education process that needs to go on here. And I think ESG is just becoming a bucket. And that's really what we need to address, rather than hold asset managers to account for this and say it's a bit of a, I didn't want to use the word, but a bit of a scam, when I don't think it necessarily is. I think there's just a huge education process to go.
I think you're spot on in all of those areas, and I think it was Fidelity that got called out recently by finding an exposure that embarrassed them quite substantially in what should have been an ESG compliant fund. Elroy Dimson, Professor Elroy Dimson from Cambridge Just has done some fantastic work on on looking at ESG rating dispersion, and it's huge. And Tesla is a classic example that for some ESG rating agencies,
Yeah.
is top of the pile, and for others is absolutely the bottom. We've got sort of two major problems. One is that the whole lexicon is still developing, and the framework is still developing. The expectations from investors are still developing, and even when that has developed, the preferences of one investor are not going to be the same as the preferences of another investor. And again, for us at Sparrows, that creates an issue, because there is a fundamental question as to whether or not ESG is suitable for a rule-based approach. Our conclusion at the moment is that it is. But you've got to bear in mind there's a whole spectrum of ESG, of responsible investing. If you start with a cap-weighted portfolio, the whole market, and have that as your left-hand end, as you move right, you move into what is pure ESG. And pure ESG is actually a framework for due diligence during the investing process. And it's about identifying the risks that are facing a company and what that company is doing to address those risks. And if you think about that process logically, if one improves one's due diligence by focusing on an increased number of risks to what we're being focused on beforehand, and looking at how a company is engaging with those risks, you should improve the risk-reward ratio of your portfolio through that process. So you arguably could see a blip up in performance associated with that. If you move further to the right, you move into SRI. SRI is about not filtering and not weighting a portfolio according to ratings, but filtering it to take out noxious activities and industries. And once you start knocking out portions of the market, you're into a much larger question, which is what are you doing? You're making your portfolio smaller, you're making it more concentrated, and you're cutting out the sin industries. Is there an expectation of an enhanced performance from doing that, or is there an expectation of a reduction in performance? Logically, there should be an expectation of a reduction in performance, particularly over the short term. The movement of capital into virtue stocks creates a momentum process that flatters the performance of those stocks. But once that's finished, where do you balance out, and where is the capital all trying to sit? Then when you move further right and you move into impact, and impact is you're attempting to do good, and there is a rational expectation that you will forego some return in that process. Although that's not what the marketing is currently telling you, but there is a rational expectation that you do that. And you move further right on that spectrum and you're into philanthropy. And so that whole process...
I was just going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, though, when you were talking about reputational risk, because actually the asset managers that I'm speaking to at the moment, because reputational risk is beginning, and I go back particularly to Nordic asset managers, where a lot of the conversations started, and the concentration risk is really developing now, because if you start looking at subsidiaries, if you start looking at your supply chains, they're invested in transportation. Unfortunately, the majority of their profits are earned transporting coal in China, for example. All of a sudden, that is off the list. So there's a big difference between stewardship and working with a company to a transition economy, which would be, in some senses, would be a good idea. And actually, if you're explaining that to end investors, that probably would be something that they would buy into. But I think the momentum now is such that actually it is, I do not want to invest in any fossil fuels, and so the exclusion factor is starting to kick in. And as you said, Fidelity, nobody wants to wake up and see their name on the front page of the Financial Times for all the wrong reasons.
Yep.
There's a massive education process that needs to go on.
We're gonna hold it there so we can move on to our next speaker, Charlotte O'Leary. Mr. Mark Northway, thank you very much indeed. Can we please show our appreciation to Mark? Thank you. And let's swiftly move over to Charlotte. Over to you. I know you can't be with us for much longer, but please squeeze in what you can.
No, it's quite a big topic to get in impact investing, and also it's a whole spectrum. So just to give you a bit of background about pension purpose and what we do, we work with pension funds, so asset owners, with investment consultants, with asset managers. We also work with the Make My Money Matter campaign, the Impact Investing Institute in the UK. So a whole variety of network supporters. And the only way you really get impact investing to work is actually if you work across the whole value chain. A lot of the issues that we've discussed here about obstacles, whether it's to do with impact washing, rainbow washing, greenwashing, whatever you want to call it, the costs associated with that is actually to work with each of these individual organisations. And what we have been seeing, obviously, is that asset owners have been under increasing pressure, particularly pension funds, from regulation. In terms of statement of investment policies, they're having to put in place implementation statements. They also should be reporting on the alignment of their ESG objectives with asset manager incentives. And I think that's a really interesting one in terms of a behavioural change, because we haven't really seen pension funds actually implementing that yet. And I think that would drive a change in behaviour. But I think what we're seeing, obviously working with asset managers, there are plenty of organisations that are putting out impact product. And when I talk about impact, we can use the sort of GIN definition of saying that what we're trying to achieve is, an intentional, positive social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. And I don't necessarily agree that it is concessionary. I think there's plenty of evidence. If you look at the Global Impact Investing Network's asset owner survey, that you can achieve a commensurate financial return alongside an impact return, albeit the reality is there haven't been many pooled products in the impact space to be able to look at the marrying of those objectives with those returns. So what we're seeing is largely they're being dictated by individual asset owners with large mandates who are setting their own objectives. So you can't necessarily get the same perspective as you can from other pooled funds. But we're working with pension funds on the ground. We're working with local government pension schemes, with DC master trusts, who are starting to put together either an impact allocation, recognizing that we can't just be looking at mitigating risks. We also need to be contributing to solutions. Otherwise, you actually never get round this problem of having to potentially divest or move away from market indices. You need these companies to become competitive and to operate, within the indices. So it's systems-based thinking, that we need to be looking at this, because ultimately what we're doing is we're retrofitting ESG and all of these different processes into, modern portfolio theory. And I don't know whether anyone's read it, but there's been a book that's come out, Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory. There's Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth. A lot of these books are worth reading because they really do demonstrate the problem with the standard economic models that we've been using and the sort of efficient frontier way of mapping returns. And that, sustainability isn't just about, looking at returns. It's also about diversification. It's also about not being left in stranded assets. It's also about recognizing that this affects every part of the chain. So it's not just the underlying portfolio companies. What about a bloated asset management industry where we've been needing to see consolidation for a significant period of time? This, along with things like cost transparency, will really weed out the asset managers that really believe in this and that really are doing it. The concern is that the regulation is not shifting far enough along the spectrum to really help asset owners when it comes to impact. So we see a proliferation of impact product measuring against the SDGs or net zero frameworks, using different types of models, whether it's the impact operating principles or impact management projects ABC framework. And the difficulty is that these don't show financial returns alongside impact. They show impact return separately. And so it's very difficult for asset owners to work out what models they should be using. And so the way that we've been working is to do a kind of case study approach. Actually, let's go through the good governance framework you need to set in order to make sure that you are getting managers and investment consultants that align with your impact objectives. And I think that's really, really key, is that ultimately, I don't think asset owners have felt empowered for a very long time to talk about whether it's incentive structures or fees or sustainability or any of these issues. And that's what we really need to work on, is the education element. And that's what we're focused on as an organization. So those are the kind of main, I've touched on loads of different points there, and there are lots of things that we could talk about impact investment. I certainly know that there's still a lot of cynicism, I think, in this area. But my concern is that people are already on this journey. Asset managers are already marketing that they do this, and so we need to be empowering asset owners to ask the right questions of those managers.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. Thank you. You squeezed one hell of a lot then in a very short period of time.
I did. And the other thing to say is, Pensions for Purpose, we actually have gone through the B impact assessment. So we are a pending B Corp. I think if you really want to understand if an asset manager or a company really believes in this, ask them whether they're going to become a B Corp or whether they're actually putting the time and effort into looking at their social environmental impact. And if they're writing that into their articles of association, I think that'll probably give you a good idea of whether they really believe it or not.
Thank you, Charlotte. A quick question for me, then we'll open it up. So, are you finding asset owners, pension trustee boards, clients, are you finding asset owners having a genuine appetite for these kinds of ideas now, or are they almost being pushed into it by all the media, all the attention? Which of those two does it tend to be?
I think it's different things. Definitely a combination. So I mean, Surrey Pension Fund, who we've been working with and who are signed up to the impact investing principles for pensions, they were lobbied significantly by, well, I'm sure you can imagine the sorts of groups, but Extinction Rebellion has quite a foothold in Surrey, which probably isn't where you would imagine it would have. Yeah. And so they went through a significant education exercise on divestment. They're not divesting, but they have done an SDG mapping exercise across their entire portfolio. And so one of the other issues that we're concerned about is that you set up an impact bucket, you say, great, these are all the positive impacts I'm having over here. Well, what is your net impact? You need to understand as an organization, to the extent that you can, what your net impact is. And that's the same for asset managers. It's no good a standard asset manager bringing out impact product and then saying, yeah, we're not looking at what our impact is over here. It's a nonsense. So that's the way that we come at it. However, we recognize that some pension funds are on a journey, and what they want to do is they want to get a sort of foothold. They might start with a small allocation to impact, and generally what we're finding is that they're having to force the consultants to do it. So many of the sort of mainstream investment consultants, it's a kind of don't ask, don't tell. If you don't ask for it, we're not going to tell you about it. We're not necessarily doing the review and the manager selection exercise, and they usually get the asset owners to pay for the due diligence as well. So there is a sunk cost. So there are definitely hurdles to get through. But what I would say is the launch of the Investment Consultant Sustainability Working Group, which has an impact stream, has helped that, I think, and also they recognise a competitive advantage. So, for instance, Reddington has realised that this is an advantage with local government pension schemes, and they want to get into that market. And so, therefore, they're starting to do SDG mapping. So, it comes through different forms, but the way that we think you get through the BS, if I can use that, is to empower the asset owners to be asking the right questions. And I still think we don't talk about incentive structures enough. Why are asset managers still paying themselves huge bonuses, huge salaries, and then the fees are still hot? It's full systems change you have to be looking at.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. Very interesting indeed. Our next speaker, Dan Brocklebank, who's got one of the Just a Minute rounds, may well want to pick up on the point you made about incentive structures. I wouldn't be surprised if Dan wanted to do that. Charlotte, that's great. Does anybody have anything they're itching to share with Charlotte before we move on to Dan? I think we're all good. Let me just check my chat. Yeah, I think it's all good, Charlotte. Thank you very much indeed. Let's show our appreciation. That's very good indeed. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you. Mr. Dan Brocklebank, lovely to see you. Haven't seen you for a while, sir. You've got what we call one of our Just a Minute rounds, so please use it as you
Yeah,
will.
it's good to see you, Andy, and I recognise a few faces as well. I have to say, I realised the Just a Minute round is the shortest straw of them all because it's almost impossible to say anything coherent in under a minute. But thank you to all of that and all of those comments. I'll just say a few things, and if people want to pick it up, then that's absolutely fine. But I'm chairman of a board that's just put out an assessment of value report. And I have to say it's really disheartening when you read the reports that have been written about what others in the industry have done. I know how much work went into ours, and the intention certainly is there to put something out. So a couple of things I would say is, please, always nervous as an asset manager in this group, because people, there aren't very many of us that show up to the TTF, but we have been supportive, and we're certainly supportive of the goals. If anyone has feedback for our assessment of value, I'd be very supportive of getting that, and would certainly love to receive that. The 2 points I think I pick up on were, Charlotte, you talked a lot about incentive structures right now. And just perhaps rewind a little bit to Chris's talk, because I think he gave a lot of stats. He's in a very interesting position there. And he made what I think is the key point, is that you have to separate out gross performance and costs. You can't just look at net performance in isolation. You have to look at two sides of that if you want to form a view on value for money. And Martin then picked up on the fact that, well, how do you actually look at that performance? Because it really critically, if you want to rank or assess managers on performance, you've got to decide what time period to look at them over, and if that's representative of a cross cycle. And in my view, at the moment, we're in an extremely unusual period in history, where the last 5 to 10 years have been really driven by quantitative easing and everything the central banks have done. And I'd be very nervous with approaches towards asset allocation today that are so driven by backward-looking models, because it's highly likely, it seems very plausible to me, let's just say, very plausible, that we could be in a very different environment. And so, how do we square that? Because we have a riddle in our industry, which is that when you invest in a manager, you never know what they're going to do for you in future. And we've ended up with a fee structure, and this gets to the core of Charlotte's point, we've ended up with a fee structure where I think it's fundamentally unfair, because the clients bear all of the risk. They pay the fees regardless of the performance, regardless of whatever the performance of the manager does. So in our view, we've always tried to can we improve on that? Can we have something fundamentally better? We have taken a different approach, which is, in essence, is that our ongoing charges are zero. We pay all the ongoing charges of the fund, and we only take a fee if we add value relative to the benchmark. So what that means is that we'll show up on screens like Chris's as being extremely high cost when we've just done really well. And we can even have negative fees. And if you look at our assessment of value over the last 3 years, for example, our fees have actually been negative because we refund that performance. So I think the point I would make is that there are very innovative models out there which are a little bit different. There have been a whole host of points made here. The core challenge, though, is trying to align the interests of clients, and not just portfolio managers, but the owners of asset management businesses. I think too often it's presented as portfolio managers versus their clients. But actually, don't forget that the real distortions come in from the people who own the asset management businesses, who are looking with a very different lens in terms of what parameters to put around things. So I hope I've thrown enough dynamite in there for you, Andy.
You have, and as you know, Dan, this idea of creating a genuine alignment of interest between the asset owner and the asset manager is a thing that we return to very frequently in TTF, because it really must matter a great deal. It really must matter a great deal. And I'm always wondering, what more will it take for more managers to move in that frankly brave and courageous and equitable direction. Thank you very much indeed, Dan. Let's show our appreciation to Dan. We're then going to go to Martin White. Thanks, Dan. Thank you very, very much. Martin White, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone else so far. Everything we've been talking about so far has been clearer as we gone through. It has been the professional end. It's not been retail. And of course, the situation of retail customers, I think is, let's call it more than a little bit worse compared to the situation of trustees who've got the ability, and with the aid of people like Chris are beginning to get on top of it. I gather we might at some point have a talk later about governance. It would be very, very nice, because there are all sorts of interesting ideas of what I would call increasing the pie. The key thing about expenses is it's a zero-sum game, and really, provided you're fairly well diversified and provided you do things tax efficiently, nothing matters more than expenses, which is a pity that Chris isn't here to say here. Anyway, but the truth about expenses is something that the financial sector works hard to hide, and I believe confuse, certainly to confuse the retail public. And I'm afraid the evidence is that whilst many people working in the FCA totally understand and care about this, the FCA's brief simply does not permit them to do what's really needed, which is to point out the best value products and services. Just transparency isn't enough. People need, and I'm thinking retail here, people need to be able to access the essential information without going to an IFA. I think the the regulatory framework that says you're not allowed to say anything if it don't go to an IFA really locks in a pretty horrible market for most people, especially when you consider that a lot of people are told no, IFAs aren't prepared to talk to you, so you're on your own. Now at UXA we have a project, and actually I've got to say thanks to Transparency Task Force. So the first time I talked about this was the Transparency Task Force about 3 or 4 years ago, which is all about our project about people with the necessary knowledge and who are not conflicted in any way sharing that freely. So inevitably it's an example of the older generation helping younger generations. We're early stages still, but I believe we can make a difference. In fact, I think we're the only way that we can get through all the conflicts involved. Now, the next slide. Right, this is just one page from our Honest Money Now site. This, it's free, available to anyone, and I'm putting links in my last slide. It's still evolving, of course, and any constructive feedback's always welcome. I mean, you can spend ages delving in this and following the links through, etc. It's got a bit of a structure to it. It was written by one of our directors, John Hunter. Now, John came back to the UK relatively wealthy from the US, having worked for Tate & Lyle in the US, and was approached by somebody who tried to sell him what was a precipice bond. John, as a mathematician, worked it all out, was really shocked, wrote at length to the financial the predecessor of the FCA, it was the FSA at those times, and they took no notice at all. What he was doing was warning about the problems of precipice bonds. So spurred on by that, he learned how to do websites and wrote this thing. Now, this is very much for looking at later slide, but one thing I'd particularly draw your attention to, and actually we've just been speaking about this principle as well, is the idea for a genuine long-term partnership for active managers. Now, basically, my view is that if the managers aren't prepared to offer something like this deal, I don't want to know. And passive is way more attractive. The deal I would propose is, if you really think you can outperform, you don't need my money, do you? Put lots of your own money in it. I'll promise to keep it with you for 7 or 8 years. And as and when you do outperform, I'll give you 30%, provided you only get paid when you go beyond the level you've already earned. So a rising water type of thing. 30% of outperformance, if you can outperform, is quite fantastic, of course. So that's about it. I promised I'd be quick. The idea is for people to have a look at some of these things later on. I'm very conscious, more so as we went through, that I'm talking retail, and I think the problems and the egregious nature of the world is far, far worse in the retail space. Anyway, that's me, and I'll get rid of my screen sharing now. What I'm asking Andy, if you can, is to put these 4 slides into the material for the section.
Yeah, we will. We certainly shall. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, guys. And I kept it for 6 minutes. I know I did.
You did. You did perfectly well. Well, we're going. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Let's show our appreciation to Martin, please. And now we're going to go to Robert Delner. And if we have time after Robert, for those that want to stick around, I want to pick up on this theme of performance-based fees and alignments of interest, because I know that it's an idea that seems to be at last taking hold. Mr. Robert Delner, please, you have one of the just a minute rounds. You need to keep it quite short and sweet, Robert. Please share with us whatever you'd like to in your just a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, just pick up on a couple of points. Previous speakers had mentioned that culture is potentially one of the main drivers behind decision making. And we also saw how important data and data-driven decision making is. And I'm sure on future governance topics, we will be discussing, how that also drives culture in itself within an organization. So I just want to focus on that particular point. The other topic we spoke about was ESG and the limitations of ESG. So here is a challenge for, I think, all of us. And that is, if ESG is limited virtually by definition, and if you saw the little comment I put in the chat, was just to say that if we think about investments, they're actually all impact investments. If you turn the lens around and look at the capital that we deploy, where does it actually have an impact within the ESG and what I would include the C, the culture worlds, and how do we measure it? How do we calibrate it? How do we understand it? How do we retranslate it, account for it, report it, etc.? So these are big challenges for all of us going forward. Because on the spectrum of urgency for ESG to become real and for impact to be understood in its real terms, what I would consider as that all investments are actually impact investments in the broader sense of the term, then I think the industry itself over time will consider that impact as a term definition will potentially also disappear as we all start to look at ESG plus C plus F and C, finance and economics, in this what I would call a full spectrum approach. And previous speakers also mentioned the idea of systems thinking, cybernetic types of thinking and management and accounting. And that's the sort of trajectory, I think, which is a challenge for all of us. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Very, very good of you to share those thoughts with us. We're going to be wrapping it up now. This theme of alignment of interest within the industry is something we're going to be picking up on again. It's so important that we have a situation where the client is properly served by the industry. There are many different ways that can be done. Fee performance models of one kind or another might well be the way forward for some. Let's debate that at length in due course. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is I invite everybody to collectively show our appreciation to Jeff and Chris and Mark and Charlotte and Martin and Dan and Robert for sharing their thoughts. There's always more to cover than we have time for. I think we've run something like about 45 events so far this year, and the topics just keep coming at us. We keep getting asked to cover all kinds of different things. So let's collectively show our appreciation for everyone's participation, including, of course, all of the attendees. I think we've had a very, very constructive session. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. We'll wrap it up. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much indeed. Nice one.